if you turn the clock back, now about 7 years, a friend and colleague of mine named Johannes Lynn and I independently came to the conclusion that there was a lot of interesting work going on in scaling, but that the people who were doing it weren't in very good contact with one another. And in particular, there were separations along two lines. The people who were working in one sector tended not to talk to people in another sector. That was the more obvious one. The somewhat less obvious one was the people who were doing research and thinking about this, stuff like implementation science and stuff like that, were not in very much contact with the people who were actually trying to scale things. There was yet one more divide, a little bit less dramatic, and that was between the people who were scaling largely through social enterprise and the people who were working mostly through government. So we thought there was a lot of promise in trying to bring those little, call them sub-communities, together into a larger community of practice. And we're now 7 years into this. We're 800 strong. We've done 5 in-person or virtual workshops on an annual basis. We've done 20 newsletters. We've done something over 100 webinars. I think it's a real testament to the fact that people are enjoying and getting value out of connecting with one another. Ali, I'm relieved and happy to see you. In this particular context, the work comes out of one of the now 9 working groups, and it's also being sponsored separately by another of those working groups. The working group that John Floretta and I chair is something called the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group. And because of the subject area today, we're co-sponsoring this with the Education Working Group that Jenny Perlman-Robinson and Gail Simon co-chair. The idea in each of these sessions in each of these working groups, is to have about a quarterly, but in this case, I'm going to suggest we're going to go somewhat more than that, but about a quarterly get together around some topic that we're pretty sure is of common interest. And then to have across the whole community of practice, a variety of things that we think benefit from crosstalk among these different working groups and not necessarily from confining it to one or the other. That's the same principle that underlies the annual workshops and that underlies the newsletter. We've just done a paper, some of you may have seen it, I like it very much, that was drawn out of our annual conference this past year that looks at 10 major cross-cutting themes in scaling. We're about to do another one that relates to the conversation going on between systems change and scaling and how those two relate to each other and what they potentially contribute or conflict with each other about. Today's is in a series of conversations we've been having about the role of monitoring and evaluation in scaling. And I'm going to ask Natalie to put up a slide, just one slide for a second, about the 3-tier framework. All right, so many of you have seen this before, but those of you who are joining us for the first time have not. This came very much out of the discussions of the M&E working group, and it suggests that if you wanted to think about the information or the M&E needs for scaling, you could think about them in terms of 3 tiers. There's what we call tier 1, which are things that usually relate to proof of concept. That's where things like RCTs usually fit. Namely, looking at an intervention and does it really work, or what's the effect size, and so on. It's also where some of the pilot testing works, the evaluability assessment goes there, various things related to articulation of a model. And we, as a community, decided that although there's always room for improvement, generally, as a group of practitioners and academics, we're not so bad at that. Our techniques have gotten much better thanks in no small part to people like JPAL and IPA and others who've really worked hard on this issue over time. That was not where we felt the biggest gap was. Tier 2, we thought was much less well handled. And that was the kind of analytics that would really help with refinement, streamlining, and assessing scalability. So now you've got a prototype that works, there's some proof of concept, but what's the kind of testing and information that allows you to refine that, and not only for its robustness, but for its compatibility with the environment that it's sitting in? We felt we could make a contribution there as a group. And third, in change management. What about when you're actually in the process of trying to scale something? What kind of monitoring and evaluation serves best then? And we decided some of that has to do with fidelity, but some of it also has to do with how do you monitor the institutionalization process and the actual transition to scale. And it was our view that the community as a whole is rotten at that, is really rotten at that. So we decided as a group to focus primarily on tiers 2 and tiers 3. Now, Ollie's going to be talking today about something that makes active use of RCTs. So you might say, well, why are we doing something that so seemingly fits into tier 1 if we made this affirmative decision to focus on tier 2 and tier 3? And it's because John and I think, and John will say more about this, but we think it's a particularly interesting case of how RCTs, in this case, and other analytics fit into the process of doing what normally happens in tier 2 and tier 3. Namely, what happens not when you're trying to develop an intervention, but when there already is an intervention and you're trying to tweak it, and you're trying to move it forward, and you're actually looking to and working with the people who are delivering at scale to use analytics, in this case, rigorous analytics, to try and guide the process. That's the conversation that Ollie's going to move us through. I'll say just one more thing looking to the future on this, which is that following today's session, we're going to return more obviously to tier 2 and tier 3. And we decided, John and I, based on input from a number of you, to focus most of the rest of the year on the issue of how do you track and what are the analytics needed for institutionalization. If you believe that there are really two pillars to scaling, coverage and institutionalization, our metrics are much better on coverage than on institutionalization. And we've decided that as a working group, we want to focus on institutionalization, how to track it, what it means, and how it plays out across different sectors. Any of you who are not a member of the community of practice at all and would like to be, it's easy to do. You just go to our website, which is www.scalingcommunityofpractice, all one word, .com. And you'll see a possibility to register yourself. There's no cost. It'll mean that you get the newsletters and are invited to future things. And we'd, of course, like contributions from you as well. Thanks very much. I'm now going to hand over to John Floretta.
Thank you very much, Larry. And we're really excited for today. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Alejandro Ganimien. Ale is assistant professor of applied psychology and economics at NYU Steinhardt. His work focuses on how to reform incentives, capacity, and supports of school systems in developing countries to promote learning. I had the pleasure of working with Ale in JPAL's South Asia office between 2015 and 2017 when he was a postdoctoral fellow there. And he's going to present today about an early childhood development program, the biggest in the world, in India, called the Integrated Child Development Support Program. It reaches 36 million children each year, 3 to 6 year olds. And there's through 1.3 million kind of preschool centers, Anganwadi centers. And they're focused on improving health, nutrition, and preschool education. But Ale is going to be presenting on, essentially, if you can kind of think about it, like this program is already scaled. And so what Ale's work is focusing in one particular state, the state of Tamil Nadu, which I'll tell you more about. It's a state in the south of India, about 70 million people. And the program in Tamil Nadu is reaching 4.2 million children. And JPAL developed a partnership in 2014 with the government where we were working, it was a partnership anchored in the finance and planning departments. And the aim of it was to test promising tweaks to existing programs or new concepts with the idea that maybe they were new that the Tamil Nadu government wanted to explore. Maybe it was leveraging learning from other parts of India or other parts of the world. But the idea was, what as a mechanism for learning, if there was this innovation fund that the government itself set up with JPAL as a partner, and it could test different ideas. And so what Ale is going to present is one of 3 different innovations he and 2 co-authors working on, with the government to test if this program could be improved, particularly to improve health, nutrition, and learning. I think it's an interesting example, and Ale, as you see, is a very dynamic presenter. He's one of my favorite colleagues that I've ever worked with. He's very smart, incredibly hardworking, and very kind. And so it's fun 7 years after meeting him to see him presenting as a professor. So with no further ado, Ale, I'll turn it over to you. I guess one last thing, I guess, is that what we're going to do is Ale's going to present for about 25 minutes. Larry, 4 moderated breakout rooms, and there'll be 2 questions, like kind of what did you find interesting or curious about this work, and what questions do you have? And then so the moderators will then bring us back into plenary after 15 minutes of discussion, where we can direct some of the most pressing or interesting questions to Ale for the final 20 minutes before Larry wraps up and shares what else we have on tap in the M&E working group. So now, really, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ale. Ale?
Thank you, John. Thanks first and foremost to Larry for the invite, and to John and Jenny for facilitating putting together the working groups. I really do appreciate this opportunity to speak to all of you, and it's so much fun to see so many friends in the guest list. Now comes the hard part of trying to share my presentations. Let me hope that we do this right.
While we're waiting for Ali, I just wanted to say one thing that really struck me when I heard Ali make a version of this presentation before. In a sense, it's almost assumed in his presentation, but what John mentioned briefly to me is super important, which is how JPAL and the government of Tamil Nadu actually had the relationship that made this possible, and that basically allowed evidence to play the role it has so far and potentially could play in all this. So I hope when you all are listening to him, you'll be listening with at least some questions or observations about that, because I'm hoping in the discussion we can talk not just about the research and what it says about early childhood education, but about this kind of intervention and what it can do about changing policy. That's why it's in this M&E group and not just in the education group.
We have a couple of, we want to focus on the M&E of institutionalization, and specifically looking at models being institutionalized in a national government context, and the process of monitoring evaluation to see how that's going and to provide feedback. So we're going to have one session that will be on June 3rd. We'll share more information shortly. That'll be focusing on education and feature Educate and Young Love, both working in with African ministries of education. And in July, we're setting up a session that would be focused on health, that would be with living goods and last mile health. So following that, we're going to be focusing on lessons from donors in August and in September. But this is like kind of a 4-part series, which will launch next month, and we're in June, and we're really looking forward to welcoming as many of you that are interested.
And we're hoping at the end of all that, this is a hypothesis on our part, that as a group we're going to be able to draw some interesting conclusions about institutionalization across a range of sectors and a range of actors. Okay, all right. You're on, Ali.
This is, as John was saying before, a project that I started as a postdoc at JPAL South Asia in 2015, and it's still in the making, as you will see. Sort of we're in the middle of presenting some of this insights to the subnationals and national government, and sharing them with other researchers. So feedback is very much welcome on both the research and sort of potential extensions of this work. And this is, I wanted to highlight joint work that I'm doing with professors Karthik Muralidharan at UC San Diego and Christopher Walters at UC Berkeley. I think that I don't need to convince anyone when I say that there is a growing consensus both in the academic but also in the policy community about the importance of early childhood development. We know, and increasingly, that development or development events and foundational skills such as seeing and hearing, or receptive language and speech production, or higher cognitive functions happen at different points in time for young children, and they build onto each other. We also have been learning that early exposure, so exposure in the first few years of life to risk factors such as poverty, malnutrition, poor health, or in stimulating environments, can have long-term effects in the brain structure and also in its functional capacity. And we've been learning that children's cognitive and social emotional development are strong determinants of their school performance. Now, admittedly, the evidence on all three of these points is a little bit more incomplete and case-based than we would want, but it is consistent across cases. And so it is it is for those reasons that we're sort of pretty confident about its validity. Now, The Lancet, this well-known journal, organized 3 series to date on early childhood development. And the last one of those series, which came out in 2016, published in 2017, part of what the research group did that co-authored one of the main articles in that series was to calculate how many children are at risk of not meeting their developmental potential based on 2 main indicators, which were extreme poverty and growth stunting. So whether they were shorter than they were expected to be because of their at the age that they were. And based on those calculations, about 250 million children are at risk of not meeting their developmental potential in low and middle income countries. The top country in that list was at the time India. I believe that's still the case. This calculations were an update from an earlier version. And they also showed evidence from a number of countries, of developing countries, that convey that children who are both stunted and who are experiencing poverty complete fewer years of schooling. They also learn less in adjusted years of schooling terms, and they also are less likely to earn higher wages as adults once they, in the few cases where we've been able to track children into adulthood. In spite of this, all of this activity, though, or this consensus, I should say, there is relatively little rigorous evidence on how to improve early childhood development at scale. So this emerging consensus has led to, as I said before, this proliferation of research on early childhood interventions. It's also galvanized quite a bit of attention in the international community around goals. So goal 4.2, as I don't need to tell any of you, focuses specifically on early childhood development among the Sustainable Development Goals. There's been policy frameworks on what constitutes good early childhood development. One of them is the World Bank Systems approach to benchmarking for education results. And there's also ongoing monitoring efforts such as UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster surveys. There's also been quite a bit of advance on measurement on child development. So how do we measure child development? How do we measure center quality? And I'm thinking specifically about Save the Children's IDELA and the consortium's measure of center quality, led in part by UNICEF, called MELCO. However, when one focuses on the evaluations that can actually credibly estimate the causal effect of interventions, most of them focus on very small samples. And in many of those cases, they focus on interventions that are implemented by non-government actors, particularly among the lower income countries. Just as an example, in one of the sort of later reviews of early stimulation and parenting interventions, just the median experimental study included only 135 children, right? So these are very large countries that we're often doing research in. And so these types of insights are very important as a proof of concept, perhaps, and also to demonstrate what we can do. But in terms of helping us cross that bridge between evidence and sort of like policy implications, they're a bit more limited, admittedly. Natalie, if we can go to the next one. Excellent. So what we're trying to do in the study that I'll present today is try to generate evidence from, as John was saying in the beginning of our conversation, the largest early childhood development program in the world. This is known as the Integrated Child Development Services, or ICDS in India. It serves over 36 million children between the ages of 3 and 6. It actually serves a lot more children below that age range and through a host of nutritional and health interventions. It also serves their mothers. So it's actually quite the large program. And it does so mainly through about 1.35 million Anganwadi centers. Now, the literal translation of Anganwadi centers is courtyard centers, but really what they are centers that initially started focusing on feeding, really, child feeding, then expanded the focus to health and nutrition, and only recently have they expanded their focus to education. So that's why it's always sort of important to communicate that sort of that brief history, because I think that if you think about them only as preschool education centers, then you're missing sort of the progression that these centers and this system really has underscore. Not only can we click on that AWC picture just to show everyone who might not be familiar with the context what an Anganwadi center looks like, and also because pictures of lovely children will brighten up our day anyway. Excellent. So that's what it looks like. So what you're seeing there are children around the main helper. I will tell you more about the staffing in the center in a second, and that is feeding time. Now, this is a pretty nice Anganwadi center. I would say among the ones that I've visited is actually one in Chennai, which is the capital of Tamil Nadu. But you will see that the centers, to the extent that they can't, are sort of plastered with different educational messages, often have a corner with toys that children can play with. And then many of them, most of them, I would say, have a kitchen attached to it where the Anganwadi helper prepares the food. So in spite of how important ICDS is, it actually has very limited staffing. So, two things that I forgot to mention. So the first one is the services that are provided are free, and they're also disproportionately catering to low-income families. So ICDS actually starts with a program exclusively for disadvantaged areas. It later expands to the rest of the country. And as I said before, it not only focuses on preschool education, but it also focuses on health and nutrition. And the order in which this has happened is going from feeding to health and nutrition to preschool education. So preschool education is a pretty new task for this center, so I guess is what I would love to emphasize. So in spite of all of these tasks that are put on Anganwadi centers, they actually are very limited in staffing. So each center typically has a worker and a helper. The worker has tons of responsibilities, including responsibilities at the center, such as teaching preschool education, overseeing the feeding, the school feeding programs, providing nutritional supplements at the center. They also have a number of responsibilities in the community. So they do home visits, they monitor children's nutritional status, they provide supplemental nutrition, they co-organize with the local nurses immunization camps and health checkups of the community. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, they're required to complete these 13 incredibly detailed administrative records on everything from the children's sort of background information and information of their family, all the way to registering their growth, their weight, and their attendance, among other things, right? So you can get a sense that the worker has quite a lot to do. Now you might say, well, but there's a helper. Yes, sure, but the helper is mostly in charge of cooking, of feeding children, and also of cleaning the center. So Natalie, if you want to skip over to the next slide. So as you can see, sort of in the setup of the division of labor within the staffing of the center, there seems to be a lot put on the plate of the worker. So as Larry started to say, and then John elaborated on, the study that we present today is was done as part of a bigger partnership between the state government and a research center, which was JPAL South Asia, so the regional office of the Poverty Action Lab for South Asia, which is based in Delhi, and its partner university is in Chennai, which is in Tamil Nadu. And just a little bit about the context, the state of Tamil Nadu is the sixth largest in terms of populations and one of the more developed. It serves about 4.2 million children, ages 3 to 6. That's about 4% of that age group nationwide. There's also even though the state sort of performs above the national average in terms of nutrition and learning outcomes, it actually the nutritional and learning outcomes are quite poor by global standards. So about 27% of children are stunted, 24% are undernourished. And then many of the children just are not quite ready to start school in grade 1, right? So for based on this sort of community-based survey that it's been done in India for the past 10 plus years, about 41% of children can't recognize letter and 28% cannot recognize numbers, right? So in 2014, as John was saying before, the government of Tamil Nadu partnered with JPAL to institutionalize this evidence use. They set up a fund for innovation and testing across sectors, so health and sanitation, nutritional education, labor and skills. To date, or at least I would say until last year, there were $4.5 million that were awarded through this partnership. And the researchers are basically conducting two types of studies, or 2 or 3 types of studies, but mainly 2 types of studies. So scoping studies to diagnose needs and propose interventions, and then the evaluations of those interventions through randomized experiments. So again, to date, there's been about 15 projects across 9 different departments and 34 researchers. And Natalie, if you want to skip over to the next one while I elaborate in this slide. This is a partnership that is based in the planning department, but it was quite interesting to see a multi-sectoral partnership, right? So oftentimes, even though our main counterpart is with ICDS, we invite the staff from the education department to come and provide feedback on the studies that we were doing. So the multi-sectoral aspect was actually quite beneficial. So what we proposed to the government to do is to evaluate the effect of hiring an extra worker in each center to focus on preschool education, and we did so for many different pieces of evidence. So one of them was that some of us have been working for a while on documenting the extent to which children in India sort of failed to meet expectations in terms of sort of curricular knowledge. For a number of years now, we've documented this with quite precision, to showing that the vast majority of children are actually below grade level. The distribution of preparation for schooling within each grade is actually quite wide, and the expectations, the difference between the expectations and the actual learning levels of children actually widens through primary education. This sort of made it front of mind for us to focus specifically on learning, or improving learning at the beginning of preschool education. We had also conducted, this was one of the first things that I did as a postdoc, what we call the scoping study. Now, what is a scoping study? As I said, a scoping study is a descriptive study to understand needs. We did so in 24, very small sample of Anganwadi centers, but we did so across urban areas, rural areas, and tribal areas. And we were quite shocked to find that even though the government had mandated about 120 minutes a day for preschool education, the average center only provided about 38 minutes of that. This is a finding that we'll replicate this much larger study, so I'm feeling pretty confident sharing it with you. And in some of the surveys that we administer to Anganwadi workers, and also in our informal conversations through our field visits, I did quite a number of them, the workers were mentioning that they were quite understaffed relative to their responsibilities. And finally, the final piece of evidence that sort of led us to propose this intervention was that Tamil Nadu had already experimented with it. In fact, there was a 2-worker model that had been experimented with in the 1990s with some World Bank funded, but once the funding dried up, the project had ended, right? So we wanted to understand, well, would it be feasible and also sort of financially responsible for the government to take on this model, and how would that benefit children and of course their families, right? So the evaluation that I present today, as John was mentioning, is part of a much larger study across 800 Anganwadi centers, comparing not just the intervention of the extra worker, but actually also 3 other nutritional focused interventions. So a supplementary nutrition intervention, an unconditional pay increase for all the workers, and a pay for percentile intervention for workers to improve the nutrition of the children specifically. So Natalie, if you want to skip over to the next one while I elaborate on that last point. Those interventions will be presenting separately, but it's quite interesting. The one fact that you should know is that for those nutrition-focused interventions, we didn't find any impacts on nutritional outcomes. And so just keep that in mind as I go through the results of this specific intervention, which was not focused in nutrition. We drew a sample of about 320 centers for this specific study across 4 rural districts in Tamil Nadu. And we did so in a way that allowed us to reweight our estimates to be representative of the population of Tamil Nadu of about 60 million. So Tamil Nadu is in the south of India. So you can see over there, it's very, very hot and steamy. And every time you get out of the plane, it's like you're inside a sauna. It's pretty amazing if you like hot weather. We, as you can see through the on the orange districts that are highlighted, those are the 4 districts in which we conducted our evaluation. So within those 320 centers, what we did is we randomly assigned half of them, which we're going to call throughout treatment centers, a grant to hire this facilitator to teach preschool education specifically. And the requirements for facilitators were quite similar to those of workers, but the difference was that they were hired on 2-year contracts, right? So unlike other temporary workers in India and other developing countries, these temporary workers knew that their contract would end at the end of a 2-year contract. There was no expectation of them being incorporated into sort of the ICDS stable workforce. So their eligibility was based on the criteria for workers. So they had to be female, they had to be 18 years old, they had to reside in the community. These are the same requirements for the workers. And then unlike the workers who are required to pass grade 12, these facilitators were required to pass grade 10. Importantly, just for lessons for scaling, the government itself developed manuals and trained facilitators. This was not something that we did, and I cannot emphasize this enough. This is something that the government did. So 6 days per year on the expected division of labor with the workers. This is one requirement that we asked just for the purposes of the evaluation, which is to we asked facilitators that they log their daily activities on a register, and they were expected to work and be paid, and they were paid for half the time of workers. And I think I have a couple of figures on salaries in a couple of slides. Natalie, if you want to skip over to the next one while I discuss the last bullet, the other 160 centers which were also randomly selected just continued as usual, right? So they have 1 worker, they have 1 helper, and everything else remains the same. So the materials remain the same, the operation hours remain the same, so on and so forth. Now, this is something that I think is quite important that often gets overlooked in our evaluation, which is that the state government already had quite a number of elements in place that enabled this transition of teaching from the worker to the helper. You might think, how can someone who has passed grade 10 and has received only 6 days of training can be expected to actually teach preschool education? How is that possible? Well, First and foremost, it is possible because the government of Tamil Nadu had created a preschool education curriculum that focused on the development of the whole child. They had a theme for each month. They had a theme for each week. They also had very specific guidelines on the activities that the worker and now the facilitator should conduct to promote different types of skills. And I will show you an example in a second. It also had distributed learning materials. So there were learning kits for kids, there were materials for teachers. So all of this infrastructure for teaching preschool education was already in place right before we started with our intervention. This is what one day of that schedule looks like, just for illustration purposes. So not only is there a set time for every different type of activity, but there's also the different skills that are promoted. So the activities in dark purple are showing educational activities. So there's a monthly theme, as I said before, there's a knowledge gain activity, a language development activity, a physical development activity, mind and social development activity. And all of that happens in the window that we're going to study. And then in the afternoon, there's supposed to be school readiness, but that happens with sort of less stable frequency. And so we focused on that 10 to 12 p.m. Time band. If you want to go back, Natalie, to the main slide, during our observations. So whenever I say to you, this is how much time was devoted to instruction, I'm talking mainly about that 10 to 12 p.m. Preschool education time. All of this infrastructure was already in place for the facilitator to take advantage of, and given the detailed level of guidelines, it did not take much for the facilitator to catch on to what she was expected to do. Just very quickly on this, we collected 5 main types of data. I'm going to present to you some data from assessments of math, language, and executive function skills. We measured, of course, children's weight and height. For both of those measures, we did that before the intervention was implemented, just to understand what the baseline levels were. And after the intervention was implemented, to understand the impact of the intervention. We did so not only at the centers, but a very important and common phenomenon in India is that parents know that ICDS centers are not focused in education. So the moment that the kid is old enough to actually transition to a preschool center or any of the other options for a public preschool center, they actually do so, and they pull them out of the Anganwadi center. So we were anticipating, and we actually saw quite a bit of churn in the sample of our study. So that's why we measured children both in their homes and in the center, so that we captured the effect of the intervention for children who sort of attended consistently, and the effect of the intervention for children who were just there at the beginning of the study, but not necessarily sort of attended consistently. Briefly say, we also tracked implementation fidelity, so how well the intervention was implemented. And we also conducted both unannounced visits to check for workers and facilitators' attendance. And we also checked the distribution of time for both workers and facilitators. Now, on to the first set of results. The intervention happened quite well as expected, which was very comforting for us to see. So virtually all the centers that were supposed to have a facilitator hired one. So 5 months into the study, 98% of centers had a facilitator. The average facilitator, in fact, was hired within 15 to 30 days of a notification being issued, which is quite remarkable for a developing country context in general, but also for India specifically. Nearly all of the facilitators received the training that they were supposed to receive. So 97% of them reported having received it, and the average facilitator reported the specific amount they were supposed to receive. The majority of the centers, to my surprise at least, had an activities log that was not only complete, but in 71% of the cases up to date. And as I said before, the facilitator, Natalie, if you want to skip over to the next one, was paid about half the salary of the worker, because she was expected to do to work for about half the time. So what I'm showing you here is the differences between groups and center opening times that we recorded as per the unannounced visits. So the y-axis is showing you the percentage of centers that are in a given condition, and then in the x-axis, I'm showing you three main categories: the number of centers that were open by the official opening time of 9 a.m., the number of centers that were open by the official start of preschool education, which was 10 a.m., and then the number of or percentage of centers that were actually closed during these unannounced visits. The first thing that I want you to notice is that less than half of centers were actually open by opening time, regardless of whether they were control or treatment centers. So you can see that the norm is actually to open by preschool education time, which is what we were seeing. But perhaps the most important finding is the one that Natalie is highlighting right now, which is that treatment centers were about 9 percentage points, or 70% less likely than control centers to be closed. And just a quick note here, while Natalie skips over to the next slide, I'm showing you a lot of bar graphs. So I'll be showing you a lot of bar graphs with confidence intervals, but the confidence intervals are just there, and the bar graphs are just there just to communicate to the findings intuitively. Some of these differences that don't seem statistically significant actually were, once we account for the fact that there were different districts and that we did the randomization of centers into treatment and control groups within specific randomization strata, right? So any finding that I will highlight today are findings that actually happened and that are statistically significant if you're concerned with those kinds of things. But just you might see that they not always match up with sort of the descriptive findings, which is what you're seeing here. So not only were centers that received a facilitator more likely to be open, there were also in those centers, the facilitators were much more likely to arrive by 9 a.m., to arrive by 10 a.m., and much less likely to be absent than the counterparts, the workers in control centers. Okay, so they were actually twice as likely as the control workers to arrive in time, and they were nearly half as likely as the control workers to be absent from the center. So these facilitators were not only higher, they were actually coming more regularly than the control, and we can skip over to the next one, that the control workers would have been. So it's an important difference in terms of not only center opening times, but also in terms of the presence of the workers. Now here, what I'm comparing is the control workers and the treatment workers. So did the introduction of a facilitator change the behavior of the actual workers in the centers? It looks like it did. So less than a quarter of all the workers were arriving by the official start time, but you can see that the arriving of by the official opening time is nearly twice as large in treatment centers as it is in control centers, and sort of correspondingly, control workers were twice as likely to be absent as treatment workers, right? So not only are we seeing centers that are more likely to be open, not only are we seeing facilitators that are showing up on time and less likely to be absent than the control workers, we're also seeing that the introduction of the facilitator changed the behavior of the treatment workers, and that's important to highlight. And if we want to skip over to the next one. So in addition to all of those, what I want to show you is that there was a shift in dedication of time exactly as we expected. So remember, the facilitator was hired explicitly to focus on preschool education so that the worker could focus on the other activities, specifically so that they could take it, focus on health and nutrition, but also so that they could focus on their administrative tasks, right? So what I'm showing you first is the difference between the control workers and the treatment facilitators. So you can see in the first set of bars over there, then the treatment facilitator on average provided 57 or 58 minutes of preschool education per day out of the 2 hours. So that's still not the full 2 hours, but that's 1.5 times the amount of time that was provided in control centers by the workers, right? So that's quite the important difference. And interestingly, as I said before, remember that we did that small study with 24 centers in Tamil Nadu across 3 different types of areas, and we found that the regular center only provided 38 minutes of preschool education? Well, we're corroborating that finding over here, which is quite encouraging, but sort of obviously not what we would want for these centers, right? So that's my first point about time allocation. The facilitators were dedicating much more time to preschool education than the control workers would. If we can skip over to the next one, the other thing that I want to tell you is also as expected, the worker who now had a facilitator to help her shifted time away from preschool education onto administrative tasks. That's what you're seeing in the second set of bars, and into health and nutrition. That's what you're seeing in the third set of bars. Now, 11 minutes of nutrition might not seem like a lot to you, but I want to make two caveats there. Number one is that we were only observing centers from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., right? So it is entirely possible that the worker was engaging on other health and nutrition related tasks that we didn't observe during the observation window. And also, I mean, that's quite a sort of a relative improvement in terms of sort of the minutes per day, right? We're jumping from about 6 to about 11, which is nearly a sort of a doubling of the time devoted to health and nutrition. Now, interestingly, of course, when you introduce additional workers, there can be some slack, and that's also what we're seeing here. So in the fourth set of bars, you're seeing that there was also an increase in the time off duty for the treatment workers, excuse me. If we can skip over to the next one. So centers were more likely to be open, workers were more likely to attend on time, and facilitators were more likely to attend than the control counterparts. The distribution of time was exactly as we intended. And then what happens with the children, which is sort of obviously the main focus of our intervention? Well, on the left side, I'm showing you the results of the assessments that were administered at the centers. These were the assessments for the children who were regularly attending the program, right? So who we saw all the way into the end of the intervention. You can see that children outperform, the treatment children outperform the control children in math and in language, and the difference in executive functioning is less clear. But we also see the same pattern of results in the household assessments, which is quite comforting. We just see them, of course, by a smaller amount, partly because, as I said before, the household assessments are reflecting the children who were not always attending the center sort of regularly. We want to skip over to the next one. So that would have been great. Just to wrap up the evaluation there, we produced the impact on learning that we wanted to produce. But as you can see from the next slide, there was also an impact on nutritional outcomes. Specifically, children were less likely to be severely underweight. So I'm showing you both the center measurements and the household measurements, not a great difference there. Some of those differences are larger than the others. And then if you want to skip over, Natalie, to the next one, we also were seeing that the children who were receiving the intervention were less likely to be stunted, so to be below the expectations for growth relative to their age group, right? So that was quite a shock to us, because the increase of time allocation on health and nutrition was actually much relatively low in absolute terms, which is why sort of we did inquire about sort of well, what else could be happening outside of this observation window. So just to sum up, the centers were more likely to be open, the workers were more likely to show up as were the facilitators, and the children not only learn more, but also have better nutritional outcomes. What we then did was try to estimate whether, as I was saying at the top of the presentation, this intervention seemed to make financial sense for the government to implement. All right, and according to our own calculations, and you can load everything up over here, the expected earnings that the children would gain from once they enter the labor force as adults from these improvements in test scores was about 12 times the cost of the intervention. So to make the case for the government to actually take this on its own to implement was quite compelling, right? So what we did is we combined local data on labor force participation, the current earnings, the projected wage growth, and then we coupled that with prior research on the relationship between child outcomes and adult wages. And one of our co-authors is actually quite experienced in this domain. And then what we showed is even if we changed our assumptions somewhat to make them a lot more conservative, the economic value of the learning gains would actually quite outweigh the cost of a program. Now, that was just considering the impact on learning outcomes. If we were to also consider the impact on nutritional outcomes, the benefit cost ratio would be somewhere between 16 and 20, right? So even if the government only captured a small fraction of those potential increases in earnings that the children would experience once they enter the labor force, the intervention would still be very much economically, not only economically viable, but it would also more than pay for itself. Now, onto the contributions, and with this, I'll wrap up. Our study just offers, I think, several lessons for taking ECD programs to scale. We showed that it is possible to improve preschool education through a government-implemented intervention in the context of a lower middle-income country. If you actually look at the literature, at least for economics, you can see that those studies that are assigned to estimate the causal effect of interventions show that government-led preschool expansions have mostly improved access and learning only in middle-income countries. They actually have largely failed to do so in less developed nations. The cases in which they succeed in less developed nations is when they're actually conducted by large international organizations or nonprofits, so not through government implementation. So that's an important demonstration. And the second one is that we also present a sort of a feasible approach just to augment state capacity for service delivery in this sector. So this is sort of stepping up from the ECD space for a second, but low-income countries have very low ratios of public employees per citizen because it's just very challenging to expand their capacity at the rate of civil service wages. And so the additional pay in the civil service sector is unrelated to productivity, so perhaps it is possible to expand local hiring of staff at lower wages as a potential alternative to expand the capacity of the public sector. And I think that's it. Let's see if we have another one. But I think that's pretty much it. Try to keep it short. I'm also happy to talk about lessons for scaling. I just want to introduce the caveat here that a lot of the efforts that we have been engaged in since the end of the study for scaling have been somewhat affected by COVID. So one of my co-authors, Karthik Muralidharan, had started a study to understand how a similar intervention could be taken to scale within the preschool, the official preschool public school system. And that intervention sort of also had to be suspended because of COVID. We actually were presented to the government of India today, this very morning, to sort of present what we had learned and potential lessons for other states. And that presentation has also been stalled because of a recent COVID spike. So we've been facing a few snafus in terms of communicating the importance of this intervention and lessons for scaling, but we are quite confident that the interest is very much still there, certainly within Tamil Nadu, and I'm happy to elaborate on this a lot more during our Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for being so patient with the technology troubles.
Well, thank you for being so calm under fire. That was above and beyond the call. So I think we'll just stay in plenary as we are now and take any questions or comments people might have. I'm going to take one, and then I'll ask people, if your technology allows, use the raise hand function, and I'll recognize people that way. And if you don't have that, just bust in. So let me, Ali, I know this is the area in which you feel less sure-footed because it preceded you in some ways and post-dated you in others, but I want to go back to this issue of the relationship with the government of Tamil Nadu. And to me, the fascinating piece of the study, besides its rigor, is the way you managed to situate it with them, politically, administratively, and policy-wise. What was the the level of person you were dealing with? Were you dealing with other researchy type people, or did you have a lot of engagement either before, during, and after with people who were in a position to actually act on this and who were actively asking you questions that you were trying to answer? Were you, I'll say it a different way, were you left trying to sort of guess what would influence them, or were they specifically tasking you with questions that were teed up for them to act on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's important to first situate the context, right? So this partnership is born out of, in a way, the vision of the planning secretary, who's Mr. Krishnan. So Mr. Krishnan is very much sort of has established a professional, even a friendly relationship with the founders of JBAL. And unfortunately, I think it's important to acknowledge that, because I think that sort of was the foundation for the relationship that led to the MOU, that then led to the partnership that you're all seeing there. Krishnan is an economist. He's very much sort of academically minded. He gets it, right? When you present something like that, he absolutely understands what you're saying. Now, that would have been good for the start of the partnership, but what about sort of the sustainability of the partnership, right? We actually dealt every month, at least, if not every 2 weeks, with the director of ICDS for Tamil Nadu. Right, so we were meeting with him, and we've seen sort of quite a number by now, not only with him, but also with his sort of staff, right? So within people in the ICDS system who focused on nutrition, who focused on education, we were meeting with all of them every month at the very least, presenting our preliminary findings. Even when we just had baseline findings, they had questions for us. So why were you choosing these skills as opposed to other skills that these children are supposed to develop by this time? Why were you choosing to have the facilitator teach preschool education instead of have the worker teach preschool education and give all these additional responsibilities? So we actually knew throughout the process, we were learning throughout the process what parts of the investigation were sort of more relevant to them. So we didn't really have to do a lot of guessing, and that was quite telling. I think that there is, because of the infrastructure that was set up, the expectation that the directors of the departments would be engaged. But I think that we were pleasantly surprised by the level of the engagement and the sustainability of the engagement. And then just one final thing, but as I mentioned, in addition to being a steering committee that approves the projects, there's also an advisory committee that gives feedback on sort of what we're learning so far, right? So not only were we meeting with the ICDS director, but every month or so, we were meeting with him and his colleagues, right? So maybe someone from nutrition and family was there, maybe someone from women was there, maybe someone from education was there. And so we were also receiving feedback from all of these different government counterparts. So it was quite helpful actually to shape the intervention and to some extent sort of the way in which we presented the insights to them in a way that was relevant to them. And we also did, I should say, a lot of analytical work that didn't make it into the presentation, right? That should be obvious, but maybe isn't. But any good research practice partnership demands a lot more of the researcher than the researcher is going to put on a paper, and that's kind of important to highlight.
Just one last question along those lines, and then I'll open up to others. Do you know, or were you responsible for writing up any of that process that you just described to us? Or is what's written up the findings more akin to what you were presenting?
Was I responsible for doing what part? Sorry.
Writing up the process of how these advisory committees came together and the role that was played by the director. And one of our issues as a group is that there tends to be much less transparency and much less communication about these things that to me are so important to the utilization side of what happens. And I'm wondering whether in this case, since it is such a good case, somebody was tasked with that.
So great question. So I think JPAL is known for its research arm, but JPAL is actually a 3 vertical organization. It has a policy arm and it has a capacity building or training arm, right? So within the policy arm, there was the original founder of JPAL South Asia. This is Aparna Krishnan, a woman who not only has obviously a doctorate, but also has worked in India for over a couple of decades in this particular space. This person was tasked with leading the partnership with the government of Tamil Nadu. So a former leader of Jai Facilitation was leading this engagement, and under her was Gautam Patel, who was the director or the under director, I think, for policy. I'd be happy to introduce them to you so that you can continue this conversation. Some of the inputs that I put in here were provided by Gautam, but they do a ridiculous amount of documenting of what happened in every meeting and what they're laying for every meeting, and then of course the report back to JPL Global, which is based at MIT, right? So no, I was not tasked, but that doesn't mean that there isn't documentation on this, and I'd be happy to introduce you to that.
Okay, thanks. I see a hand from Maung. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. This is great presentation and wonderful research. I have following up on the last point that you mentioned about the lessons for scaling, and particularly, you share some of these evidences with the policymakers. What evidences you thought that was most interesting to them, so that they are most likely to scale up statewide? A related question is, the countries are different. Even within the country, the states are very different. In the context of India, southern India is very different from northeast India, which are primarily indigenous people with their language and culture and religion is very different from the rest of the country. So if you're thinking of working with central minister in Mizoram or Assam, what are some of the suggestions or recommendations you may have? Thank you.
So great questions, obviously. Thank you for those. I believe your colleague at Huxley, is that right? Is that the background that I'm seeing over there, Harvard Graduate School of Education, or is that somewhere else?
I am a graduate from Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I did my doctorate, but currently I am at NYU with Hiro and Larry with a global TI team.
Wonderful. We should chat then. So a couple of responses to the first question. So I don't think that there was a single piece of evidence that was important for them for scaling, but we had to convince them, if you will, of different things throughout the process. So number one, I think there was a perception among some that the workers were just shirking, right? And so it was incredibly important for us to document, first of all, look at all the tasks that they have. I don't understand how a single human being can do all these different tasks. So that's just in principle, just to remind them of all the tasks that they have. Number two is to actually go into the centers and register out of the 120 minutes of early childhood education that was supposed to be provided, how many of those were actually provided, and then to say, well, like, what are the workers saying? So the fact that workers themselves were actually saying, no, we're overworked and we're also potentially underpaid relative to the number of responsibilities that we have was an important stage for them to recognize that things could be different. And I also think, because I think you might be aware of this, but in India, like in many other public sector systems, good job means that you're going to be promoted out of your job, right? So that means that you're going to be promoted out of your office. Well, so that's obviously a drawback, but one way of potentially speaking to that potential drawback is to say, well, you all have experience doing this, right? So the fact that Tamil Nadu had sort of experimented with this model before, and it wasn't a new crazy idea, was also very important. So all those types of evidence were important at the earliest of stages. Now, throughout, it was very different. Throughout, it was convincing them that the measures that we were collecting were actually fair measures to collect. And as someone who focuses on measurement, that was sort of like my moment to shine. But it was a lot of, well, how did we develop the assessments? Well, on what are you basing your assessments? Because we have, a preschool education curriculum. We also have this school readiness content. We also have a national education policy. We have national education framework for ECC. So how are you reconciling all those different things? What's the validity of your measures? And so remember, they didn't know that things were going to turn out so well. So I think as a government official, the first instinct, especially if someone is looking at your work with such sort of precision, is to say, hold on a minute, is this a fair measure for you to evaluate the system? And so a lot of the convincing at that time had to do with not just presenting the results, but our process for constructing the measurements that we put together, right? So not just the child assessments, but also the way in which we were tracking division of time, right? And then at the end of it, you're talking to a slightly different group, right? You're not talking to the lower level directors and the director of ICDS. You're talking to the director of ICDS and the higher ups in the state. And so there, the evidence on cost effectiveness, the evidence on the impacts on nutrition and learning, like just was sort of the star of the show, if you will. And so I do not think it was a single piece of evidence. It was just a lot of different evidence that was responding to the need at the time, right? And then I now forgot your second question. I don't know if we have time, but we can also talk one-on-one. Tell me.
The second question was, in a different state of India, which is culturally, linguistically, religiously, and spiritually different from South. India is a big country. So.
Well, so a couple of things actually in this. So yes, Southern India is different from Northern India, but also I would argue Tamil Nadu is a very different state. You know, like I was reviewing the MOU this morning as I was preparing, you know, it had the goal of being the most progressive and most prosperous Indian state by 2023. Right? And if you look at the indications for education and for nutrition, even though they're not great by world standards, they're actually quite better than most of the countries, right? So most of the states. So that's a sort of a first point of information. The second one is something that I didn't present is when we did the scoping study in Tamil Nadu, we also did it in Rajasthan. Because there was a potential of partnering with the government of Rajasthan on a similar intervention. Just for everyone's context, Rajasthan is the largest geographic state in India. It's also quite interesting as a state because it has the same distribution of rural-urban. So it's 75 rural, 25 urban. And so it's quite representative of the country as a whole to the extent that you can be such a thing. And the situation was completely different, completely different, right? Out of 120 minutes, they were devoted in about 24 to preschool education. Many of those preschool centers were tinier than my office right here. Sometimes they didn't really have a kitchen attached to them. And so I think like we would have done a lot more scoping to understand what made sense for a state like that. So not just on the bigger dimensions, as you're saying, of spirituality or language or even sort of how to incorporate sort of evidence into policymaking, but even to the quote unquote small aspects, which have more to do with the day-to-day logistics. But we should absolutely talk more now that I know that you're around.
I want to pose a question to you, but I want to precede it with an observation and see if you have a basis for either agreeing or disagreeing with what I'm going to say. One of the things I've noticed in terms of the education field recently is that most of the advocacy has been to get more money into education. And there's certainly no reason not to do that. There are a lot of reasons to do it. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we're not going to be able to push that string too much further than we've already pushed it. And therefore, getting the most out of the money that we're spending is going to take on more and more importance in the conversation, not just what we could do if we had more money. And so that puts a certain premium on things that are either revenue neutral or cost saving, as opposed to things that simply have a high rate of return but would cost more money to do. I'm wondering if that was an issue in this case, or was there enough fiscal flex that the government had that something that was a good value but was going to cost more money was worth entertaining and had a decent chance of success. And I'm going to pose a question to everybody else at the same time, which is unrelated, but I want to get it on the table, which is that I think the case that Ali's illustrating so nicely is in some ways exemplary in terms of the relationship between research and people who are running programs at a very large scale. And if any of you either have additional questions on that, which is what I'd hoped we'd get to today, but we're not going to get there, or have additional experience yourselves trying to do this, I would be really grateful if you'd send it in to me, and we'll figure out some way to either respond to the questions with Ali's help, or to highlight the experience if you have related experience that we can share. Ali, back to you.
Sure. So I think the sort of a top level comment is to say, sure, maybe we've been raising quite a lot of money for education, but developing countries vary very widely in the amount of their own budgets that they devote to education, right? And so I think that, some of them could do considerably better than they're actually doing, right? Now, the problem still stays, which is if we don't think that this situation is going to change quite a lot over the next few years, then what do we prioritize? Or was the consideration of this intervention as a cost-saving intervention? And in fact, the rate of return is almost definite if you consider that the intervention would more than pay for itself 12 to 18 times over, right? That was a consideration. I think it was a consideration at different stages. It was a consideration just similar to the point that I was making earlier. It was a consideration at the top of the project. So to convince the government of what we wanted to do, it was important, number one, for us to consider that there was a large sector of the young female population that was unemployed that could potentially be put to work. So that is a sort of an important sort of nationwide phenomenon in India, but that's an important thing to convey. Number two, that we would not be expanding civil service wages of the Anganwadi workers across the board. That was not a feasible option for them. That is just something that they did not want to do, not only because of the amount of money involved, but also because of the potential stability of those workers within the systems. They just wanted to try.
So you constructed the experiment with a cognizance of that constraint.
Very much so. And then now it's become important again as we're starting to disseminate the findings with the government, right? So the number one question that we get, especially from not ICDS, who of course would love to have money, but of the planning department and the chief ministry of the state is, well, like, where's this money going to come from? And how is this financially viable? And so every conversation that we have about cost effectiveness means a lot to them, because they can understand that if they are able to capture those increased earnings over time as tax earnings, and we're talking about a very low tax rate, even under an assumption of 6% tax rate, they would sort of more than pay the cost of the intervention, then that is a big driver for them to be willing to continue to experiment with this and potentially expand it, as I said before, not just from the ICDS system, but to the public school primary education system as well.
I've been abusing the privilege of talking back and forth to you because I haven't seen hands going up, but if anyone wants to put theirs up, please do. Go ahead, Heidi.
Hi, this is really just a follow-up to what you were just asking about, Larry. I am curious in this whole piece of how we're potentially either just taking that leap for the government, leap of faith of yes, we believe you that it will be a 12 to 18% cost savings over time, and we're going to go with that, or I'm curious if that's kind of where it's gone, or is there talk about building in infrastructure within the country to actually do that kind of research over time? Because I think we're going to be facing. I work on a project with the IRC and Sesame Workshop that's aiming to do. This had a lot of parallels in a lot of ways, and I think it's a really useful example. And I think we are also going to face a lot of challenges in thinking about how we are talking about cost effectiveness with these things that take, a lot more time to really measure, or people are already bought into that idea of return on investment.
Yeah, I don't think that people are bought in at all. So I think that there's a couple of things that you can do to increase the evidence base, because admittedly, it's not great, Heidi, as you know, right? So number one is, as you know, the latest round of the Lancet ECD series has sort of a study on 4 or 5 different countries tracking sort of the impacts of mostly nutrition interventions onto their adult earnings. So the study that comes to mind is the Jerry Berman et al. Sort of like Guatemala study, but also the very well-known early childhood stimulation and nutrition study in Jamaica that Sally Grantham McGregor and her colleagues have done, right? So that I think that's important, just to set the stage that this is not the first time that we're going to have this conversation, and that other countries have done it, and in the times that countries have done it, they found this this relationship. Then the problem becomes, okay, but what is the right number, right? And that is a much tougher problem. So we are basing a lot of our estimates on the relationship between test scores and wages in the US, which we don't think is an ideal scenario. So what we did to convince the government that the number might differ, but the insight still holds, is to do a sensitivity analysis. So something that I didn't show here just because it's kind of boring, but that I'm happy to iterate with you on, is we said, well, let's say that we got the assumptions way wrong. So we're going to test for sort of on the lower end and on the higher end of our assumptions. Would this insight of the intervention would more than pay for itself hold? And we found that it did. And we really, really tried to make it go away, and we could not, partly because these are sort of very large test scores and nutrition impacts. And so, you know, sort of admittedly, whatever it is, the assumption that you're holding, they will still sort of pay off in the long run, right?
Ali and Heidi, I'm gonna jump in only because I'm looking at the clock and I know we're gonna lose people in a second. I'm gonna do this by saying, kind of note to self, this issue of the way cost and cost effectiveness data gets used, I think warrants a discussion all by itself. And I hope, Ali, you'll join us again when we do that. Sure. Heidi, I'm sorry to not have cut that off before the answer was finished, but it's a good enough question. I wanted to give it its due.
No worries. I agree with you.
Squeeze in your question, even if we're not going to get an answer in real time.
It's building on cost effectiveness as well, and understanding this, who are the important folks. If we are measuring an intervention with a certain segment of the Ministry of Education or the government, and we know that the costs that they're investing at that level might save costs at other portions of the government. I am really interested in understanding who we need to be developing relationships with outside of that particular intervention, so that we can get buy-in, both to invest in that intervention, but understanding that they can save in other segments, which then creates this political, sometimes perverse incentive. So I'm just, again, we might not get to it today, but would love insights on that.
Well, we're not going to get to it today, but it's a really important issue. And I can tell you it's also one that I've been working with Brookings on, because everybody seems to have now come to understand that cost effectiveness or cost benefit is an important element, but it's probably not the dispositive way to make the argument to the government, which is in a budget constrained world, not necessarily in an economics world. And so trying to figure out how to have these cost-based conversations and what kind of evidence matters, I think is a perfect conversation for us to carry on in this working group and elsewhere. I want to close by thanking all of you for apologizing for having struggled a little with the technology today, the cost of which was a breakout session we'd hoped to have as part of this and didn't. If any of you have follow-up thoughts either about this or more generally about the topic, please send them to us. And I'll remind you of what John Floretta said earlier, that our next few sessions are going to be a 4-part series on institutionalization, how you track it, how that information gets used, what it's important to know in the course of trying to move interventions toward full institutionalization. We hope any of you who've got things to contribute on that will let us know, and that any of you who are interested will join us. I want to give a great round of thanks, Ali, for a very stimulating presentation, and to all of you for participating in it. Thanks so much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much.